family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of takethe12.org. That's takethe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on takethe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about step 5 in our first legacy of recovery. And I'm so honored to have as my special guest with us today, Zach C. Zach, please introduce yourself. Tell our listeners where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little bit about how you got to AA.
Sure. Thanks, Rick. So Zach, alcoholic, nice to meet all of y'all. My sobriety date's October 9th of 2015. I currently live in Arlington, Texas. My home group is the Get in the Car group from Grapevine, Texas. And what brought me into AA, well, it was my alcoholism. But for me, I was definitely one of those people that drank alcoholically from the get-go. I was someone that picked up a drink at an early age. And when I say early, I mean, I drank, ever since high school. And for me, my drinking got really bad really fast. I drank between the years of 16 to about 23. So I came into the rooms at 23 years old. And honestly, I'm very fortunate that I was able to come in as early as I did. And I still to this day believe that I would not be here if it wasn't for someone very close to me who was also in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, kind of show me what it was like to be sober before I was sober, and I wanted what he had. And I'm very thankful that I was willing to do anything to get what he had, and I'm still here sober today. So
wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much. All right, let's jump into it. I'm going to read a couple of things just to kind of get us jump started. This is from the foreword of the 12 and 12. And it says, and I read this because I think it is probably one of Bill's best descriptions of what the 12 steps are. AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which, if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. One of the reasons that I love that is because, it breaks it down, it tells us right from the very beginning that the 12 steps are a set of principles by which we get to live our life, right? Spiritual in nature. And I love that he wrote in there, which if practiced as a way of life, not just when it's convenient, not just here and there, not just from time to time, but practiced as a way of life. Several things can happen, right? The obsession to drink can be expelled. But for me, the thing I love the most in this writing is that two things are going to happen, that it enables the sufferer, me, to become happily whole, that's the internal part, and usefully whole, that's the external part. And I didn't know that that's what I was going to get. We were sitting in a step 1 meeting last night, and we were talking about when I first got to the rooms of AA, I just thought that, that I was going to stop drinking.
Right.
I had no idea that there was going to be so much more that was going to be given to me. So I love that reading. I want to read the actual step itself, since we're here today to talk about step 5. Step is this: admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs. And I believe that every every one of our steps, since they are spiritual in nature, have a spiritual principle that's attached to it. And while I've seen a variety of different principles attached to step 5, the one that I like to use and the one that I use in the step study on Take the 12 is the principle of integrity. And also when I am working with a sponsee and taking them through the steps for the first time, I guess it's the teacher coming out in me, the educator coming out in me, but I always like to try to figure out a way to make sure that we learn it from the literature, but that we also figure out a way to synthesize it, simplify it. I don't want to use the phrase dumb it down, but it's kind of like, if you had to remember one thing about step 5 that really truly makes sense, that kind of levels the playing field, for me, it would be that as I am admitting to God, to myself, and to another human being the exact nature of my wrongs, I need to remember that others see us better than we do. And I'm sure that we're going to get into that at some point. But so when I asked you to be a guest on this podcast and I gave you the opportunity to choose what you wanted to speak on, you chose this step 5.
Yeah, I did.
Tell it. So talk a little bit about why you chose this step.
So honestly, in my sobriety, I really did not have. So my true beginning and understanding what the steps were trying to do for me was my experience post and during, but mainly post step 5. During steps 1 through 4, it really kind of just felt like I was going through the motions. Yes, I'm an alcoholic. Yeah, I still had a problem with the God thing. And honestly, like I just ran through 1 through 4, and 4 didn't really feel like it didn't seem, it felt thorough to me. But when I looked at it on paper, I felt as though I could have done a lot more just because there weren't that many people on it. But there was a lot of stuff for each individual person. And I think that spoke volumes about how I truly felt about these individuals. But when I got to step 5, it was the very first time that someone had practically and just objectively reflected the mirror back at me and displayed everything about me that I didn't realize that there was. I think a lot of people have this experience where they don't really feel like they were too bad of a person coming in. And for a lot, I think that's absolutely true. But for myself, I was definitely under the impression that I was, walking on water when I came into AA. Right. Like it was just it was the problem of everyone else, my alcoholism. I didn't have a problem with my alcoholism. Everyone had a problem with my alcoholism. If everyone just left me alone and let me do what I want to do, like everything will be fine, and just do what I want, and like everything will be great. The selfishness and the self-centeredness was pretty obvious post step 5. And honestly, when I also think of step 5, I really think about how quickly 6 and 7 and then 8 and 9 are carried out, because during my first step 5, we spent all afternoon together, and then we met together the next morning, and we met at a coffee shop, and we were discussing how to go about step 8. But really, we had done step 8 during my 5th step, because we were kind of just highlighting all of the people that should be on my amends list.
Sure.
And then of course 6 and 7 was done in the privacy of my own home. But yeah, like step 5 was the first time I feel as though that my eyes had really began to open in sobriety.
I absolutely love that. And it made me think of, if you don't mind, I'm going to just for a second, I'm going to read a snippet from the step study that's on takethe12.org on around step 5, because it kind of speaks to what you were talking about. Have you ever noticed, this is what it says, have you ever noticed that the 5th step doesn't say that we just admit our wrongs? It says that we admit the exact nature of our
Mhm.
wrongs. So we need to do more than just confess what we did. We also need to see why we did it so that we can ask God to help us with it. It's obvious that when we share our inventory with another person, but because no, excuse me. It's obvious why we share our inventory with another person, because we are masters at believing our own justifications and half truths, right? Aren't we the ones who used to say we didn't have a drinking problem? Didn't we tell ourselves over and over that we were doing fine as we were sinking deeper and deeper into the abyss of alcoholism? Since we're not good judges of character, especially our own, we must confide in someone else. Only another person can really see us as we are. That's why it says that a solitary self-appraisal is insufficient.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
You just I'm glad that that was your experience as well. I love your connection of 5 to, and what your experience was with 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, and that you identified that in our 4th step, we certainly identified what the amends were going to be made later on down the line, and we have to go back and we have to look at that. When you sat down and did your first 5th step with your, I'm assuming it was with your sponsor at the time.
Right.
What were you afraid of?
That's great. I was definitely not afraid to write everything down my resentment list. That was fairly easy, and honestly, I got a kick out of doing that. Writing down the fears list seemed was honestly probably one of the tougher things, just because I don't think my ego would allow me to see any fears that I had. I honestly didn't feel like I was really afraid of anything at all. But then, of course, my sponsor kind of went through all of the columns, and especially like that 3rd column when we were discussing, everything that it affected, and then how that all is rooted in some type of fear. At any time, like it was all the same stuff that kept popping up. My pride, my self-esteem, my ego, my personal relationships, over and over and over and over. And it's just like, well, why do these things keep popping up? It's like, well, you're trying to control the way that everyone looks at you, which I think is huge for me. And well, why am I trying to do that? It's just like, well, you're afraid of what people think of you. Well, why is that? Well, for some reason, you're not satisfied enough with yourself that you need the approval and appraisal of other people. And then that's when it starts to get really deep. And that's when really the 5th step really started to kind of, shed its light and be like, oh my God, if I really sat and kind of meditated on the way that I was really feeling about something, it's like, it's true. I was uneasy. I was restless, irritable, and discontent with everything in my life, with absolutely everything in my life. Yeah.
What did, was there one, and maybe this isn't your experience, but was, when you looked at all of that stuff and when you were sitting there reading your 5th step to your sponsor, was there one thing or a body of things that started popping up that you had thought maybe was going to be a problem at some point in your life, but once you wrote it down, you were like, oh yeah, I see a pattern here?
Yeah, that was done pretty point blank during my sex inventory.
Right.
Holy crap, during my sex inventory. I thought God, there was one particular instance with a girlfriend in high school where I had dated for a long time. She was a very sweet girl and had a lot of fun. But there was a point where she cheated on me, and I held that against her for the longest time. And I didn't realize that the reason why she did that was because all I was doing was never wanting to spend time with her, ignoring her, rather go hang out with my friends and go get wasted. So I was literally like never around her. So why in the world would she ever want to spend time with me? It's just like naturally she was looking for something to actually, actually feel wanted. I never did that for her once. And then that literally the moment that inventory was kind of dissected, I saw how that was the same pattern with every single person that I had been in a personal or sexual relationship with.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like, I wanted, I used them the same way that I used alcohol. And I think that was the hardest pill for me to swallow. I don't think anyone likes to be told that you use people. That's a pretty crappy feeling. But I think once someone understands the truth in their nature, then it becomes a lot easier to kind of look at it objectively and just say, this is my sponsor being able to help me say, Zach, this is a thing that we don't want. So in order for us to feel better, let's actually just get rid of this thing.
You said that once we understand the truth about who we are, it becomes easier to be able to, you didn't say this, but accept it, move on, make whatever the correct,
Right.
take whatever corrective measures we need to take. I wish that were true for me.
Mm-hmm.
I wish it were true for me, because I was sharing an example last night with Monday night at my home group with one of the guys there, and we were talking about I am currently in the process of taking a certificate course with Cornell University on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that that course, and in module 1 of that certificate course, we Cornell partners with Harvard to do implicit bias test, unconscious bias tests, and we had to take one of those tests, and it's divided into sections, and you can take, it identifies your implicit bias on things like race, gender, ability, disabled versus abled, LGBTQ, just all kinds of different things. And I ended up taking the test on race, and I was completely disgusted with the outcome and with what I found out about myself. Because if you would have asked me prior to taking that test, I would have said, ain't no way that I am racist. Right. Ain't no way, excuse my terrible English, no way that I have any implicit bias in my life, unconscious bias in my life, and the reality is I do. And I was so upset by the results of that test that I ended up reaching out and having a one-on-one with my faculty advisor. And I told her how upset I was. And she was so wonderful and helped me to understand that part of the awakening through that process for me in taking that test was, and having that conversation with her, was that everyone has implicit bias. Mm-hmm. Everyone has unconscious bias. It all depends upon to what level, how it manifests, and those kind of things. And I think that the same kind of thing applied to me, because when I did my first 4-step and 5th step, when I sat and looked at all of the mess that my life had become as a result of the things that I wrote down on my 4-step. It's kind of like I use the analogy sometimes of, I'm driving down the road and and the car starts spittering and sputtering, and then I end up having to pull off to the side of the road, and the car dies, and I put the car in park, and I get out and I walk around to the front of the car, and I pop the hood open, and I look at that, and because I'm not a mechanic and I'm not mechanically inclined, I look at that and I'm what's under the hood, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with all of this. I don't know what to do here. And that was much the same experience that I had when I did my first 5th step. I didn't know what to do with all of that stuff that was uncovered in my 4th step, all of the defects of character that had built the outline of my life, right? Thank God for good and effective sponsorship. Right? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, after the 5th step, it wasn't like, okay, great, all these things were shown to me. Now I know exactly how to do them. It was the exact same thing. Like, I remember just feeling emotionally exhausted after the fact, just being overwhelmed. It was, being tired, but also relieved at the same time. And then just thinking to myself, okay, great, now what? Like, do I just have to live with the fact that I'm just this terrible person? It's like, no, my sponsor was, all he said was, now we just continue the steps.
Right.
That's all we have to do. And for me, like, honestly, when I think of step 5, it's really, for me, like 5 through 9 is like that chunk, because it was immediately, once I understood and everything was elevated to the surface, it made it a lot easier to understand the reasoning for why I'm making the 9-step amends.
Right.
And my sponsor, I'm pretty sure, just like a lot of sponsors tell them, it's just like, you're not going to say sorry. You're going to admit your wrongs. Like, you've been saying sorry your entire life. They want to hear exactly what your errors were, and that you're willing to try and make amends for that, right any wrong if possible.
Right.
And honestly, it was that too. It was the conjunction of, all of the dissection in step 5, and then all of the action taken in step 9, that really I started to have, like, this experience of like, oh my God, not only, like, I remember being at like 9 months sober, and just remember thinking to myself, like, I haven't thought about drinking in months. Like,
Right.
this is ridiculous. I don't know when it happened, and then I think that was the beginning of when I started to stop trying to understand the ins and outs of the why, and specifically how the 12 steps were working. Because I was definitely one of those that needed to understand exactly how each step was going to affect my life. And then once I understood that, then I would consider taking the steps at that point.
Right.
Never did I ever consider, why don't you try them first? And if it doesn't work, like I always heard, we'll refund your misery, go back out and drink if you want to.
Right.
Yeah, so, step 5, really just snowballed into step 9, and then that snowballed into step 10. And then at step 10, it talks about how, like, when we're reviewing our day, we constructively and objectively review our day. So in hindsight, I didn't realize that that's what my sponsor was doing with me in my first 5th step. He was constructively and objectively looking at my life, and he said, it was a look at my liabilities and my assets. It was like, Zach, these are all the great things. Like, you love spending time with your family. You're funny. You love teaching kids. You love learning. And then there was all these things that we didn't want, or I didn't want for myself. And it was just like, well, if we don't want these anymore, some of these are just easy to stop doing. Some others, it's going to take a lot of work, but at least we have like a plan of attack now.
Right.
And that's what, so, it's going into step 5, doing step 5, having everything at my plate, not knowing what to do. And then just my sponsor saying, just do the rest of the steps. And then somewhere along the way, I'm 6+ years sober. I don't know what the hell happened.
Right.
I don't
Right.
know.
Exactly. It's like, how did this happen?
Yeah. I think I'm at a point in my sobriety now where I have the capacity to actually be able to ask those kinds of questions. And it's interesting getting different experiences from people. But I think, the common ground that I found with asking people their experiences in AA is that they did their best to try to shut up their brain, and they just let their feet do the work.
Right.
And somewhere along the way, things just happened to get better.
You talked a moment ago about sometimes the why can get in the way. And sometimes it is not important to know the why. But I do believe that at some point in my journey, I need to have that conversation. For example, I needed to know why I kept drinking, and every time I would put alcohol in my system, that I would develop the phenomenon of craving. I needed to know why that was so. I needed to know why. I don't know that I've ever had the answer given to me about why I blacked out, because I was a blackout drinker, but I'm grateful that our book very specifically tells us why I am an alcoholic. It's because I have a physiological chemical imbalance in my system that when I put alcohol in, that kicks in the allergy. Instead of breaking out in a rash, like if I were allergic to strawberries, I develop the phenomenon of craving, right? All I want is more, and that vicious circle continues. I needed to know that why. And I think that, and we were sitting in a step one meeting last night, and we were talking about the step one being divided into two parts: the powerlessness and the unmanageability. And that in the very beginning, when we first come into AA, all we really need to know is that we're powerless over alcohol. Now, the longer we stay, we're going to find out that we are powerless over everything, right? But when we first come in, we don't need to know that and all of that additional information. So sometimes I think the why is important, but at the appropriate point when we're ready to absorb that information.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think any newcomer at the beginning, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but like, I remember my brain just being so foggy, not very, not being able to think very well, towards the end. I was from the moment I woke up to the moment I passed out, drinker, I could barely read. It was so difficult for me just to keep sentences in my brain. I would forget what I would read. And so thinking about all those details at the very beginning, I think was just only going to get in the way of real work being done. And then once, I was at a point in my sobriety, which really for me, there were like two epochs in my sobriety, with my first sponsor and then with my second sponsor. After my first sponsor, my first sponsor moved away because he went to grad school. So at 18 months, I picked up a new sponsor. And then that's when really I feel as though I was able to start asking a lot of the questions that I had before and be pushed on a lot of things that I didn't want to look at before. And then that really started to get me to question, for instance, how people get sober, and by other means, other than Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, what is the common ground between AA and, let's say, other 12-step programs or other, recovery programs? So I had the ability at that point to start thinking like outside of the rooms of AA and start seeking guidance and counsel from people of many different walks of life. And yeah, so I have the luxury now of being able to ask those questions. I definitely didn't have the luxury at the beginning to ask those questions.
Totally agree. And you're absolutely right on that. I want to circle back for a second to something that I said in the beginning, which is, I believe, this idea that every one of our steps has a spiritual principle that underlies it. And that I like to use the spiritual principle of integrity. How did integrity, either the lack of it or the learning of it, play a role in your awakening in step 5?
Oh, oh my God. Okay. So in integrity, so for me, integrity is, am I doing the things I'm supposed to be doing when no one is looking? That is the biggest one. Because, my second sponsor always used to say, everyone is on their best behavior during this hour. It's the other 23 hours that you need to watch what they're doing.
Right.
So, and he was totally right about that, because I mean, I've seen people in meetings that look so good, that talk so well, and then I've seen them outside of the meeting. I'm like, this doesn't line up. Right. Or I do see people where I'm just like, man, this person is this way 24/7. There's just something about them that just, that translates into every single thing that they do. And those were the kinds of people that I wanted to be around, and I really wanted to be like. So I think, one, after the 5th step, having all of those things shown to me, and then, asking God humbly to remove all of these shortcomings. And, and one was the lack of integrity. And then trying to follow people that were like that, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but I would always hear, stick with the winners. Like, you need to stick with the winners in AA.
Right.
I didn't know what that meant. All I know was that there were people that I wanted to be like, that there were just certain energies around them. And I think being around those people often talking to them often. I mean, I think it was something that I just naturally wanted to eventually, I don't want to say naturally, but eventually wanted to be like. And I think that in itself kind of propelled me to want to, think about like, man, they're probably doing these things when no one's watching. I really want to be like them. So I should probably
Right.
do this also. And then just, very practically also, if I was at work and if I needed to do something that needed to be done and no one was around and I did it anyway, one, it was the right thing to do, but I also ended up feeling better about myself because once that started to be a practical part of my life, when I would it would eventually start to get to the point where I would have to consciously want to do the opposite thing. And
Right.
then once I started to do the opposite thing, there'd be that little nagging voice in the back of my head that got louder and louder and louder. And it's just like, God, I need to go back. I need to go apologize, or I need to go make amends. I need to, I shouldn't have done that. I need to go put that in its proper spot. I need to go clean that, correctly, or what have you.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I think at the beginning there was definitely a lot of mistakes. And I think the number one thing is that the voice in my head, my conscience, as they call it, has gotten louder and louder and louder these days. And anytime I ever have a question about, is the thing that I'm doing right now, quote unquote, good, or like the best decision for me? Or is this the decision of a higher Zach, or is this a decision of a lower, reactive Zach? Those kinds of questions get answered very easily nowadays, especially because I can hear all the people that I used to talk to, and I can imagine what they would say, especially
Right.
my second sponsor. Anytime I ever have a question and I'm thinking about, well, is this something I want to pursue, or is this something that I think is worth looking into? I can always hear Casey's voice in the back of my head,
Right.
like legitimately hear it, and it's just like I already know, like I already know exactly what needs to be done here.
Right. And that's that gut instinct,
Mm.
that knowing that what did we hear last night? The lurking notion that I know what's right. I know what's right.
Right.
So and speaking, so you've talked a fair amount about sponsorship, and so I want to kind of flesh that out and unpack that a little bit more. You've talked about your experience with a sponsor in step 5, because I know that you have sponsored men and you have taken men through the steps yourself. Share what some of your experiences have been in taking men through the steps, particularly listening to their 5th steps. What has been your
Oh
experience
God.
of that?
Um, I would say selfishly, the looking back at doing 5th steps with other guys, I honestly got the most. I feel as though I got a lot out of it, maybe way more than them, just because I feel as though that it was so easy to dissect what was going on in their 4th steps that it made a lot of the stuff that I had written down in my previous 4 steps highlighted in a different light.
Mm,
And it made it, of course, my understanding of the big book grew, my understanding of the 12 and 12 grew, but my understanding of myself grew in the process.
right.
But, like there's a reason why, like I understand now why my second sponsor used to say, Zach, there's nothing you can tell me that won't shock me. Trust me, like I've heard it all. And I was very unsure of that statement, because I'm like, I'm sure there's bound to be something. But through the handfuls of 5th steps that I've heard, it's just like it's all the same stuff.
Right.
It's all different activities, if you will. Like everything in the external may look a little bit different, but it's all rooted in the exact same thing. Like, oh my God, this guy is just an alcoholic. This guy is extremely selfish. This guy has a big ego. Whether he thinks he's better than everyone or whether he thinks he's worse than everyone, which I think needs to be a clear distinction. And yeah, all the fears, everything that makes them tick, all the things, maybe not everyone is exactly the same,
Right.
but there's many commonalities between a lot of the 5th steps that I've done. Yeah, absolutely.
It's and to me, and I think you displayed this, that listening to someone's fifth step is absolutely part of the description that Bill gave in the forward to the 12 and 12 of what our 12 steps are, in that it allows us to be usefully whole.
Right.
Right. And I get to provide that same experience for another alcoholic that was given to me. And I too have the experience of, you can't tell me anything that I haven't already heard. And I really actually kind of took that as a challenge, right? Oh, wait a minute, you haven't lived my life, right?
Right.
And there were some things that I put on my first fifth step that I was terrified, that I knew I was going to take to my grave.
Right.
That because I knew if anyone ever knew of these things, that I would be an outcast and so forth and so on. And but I put them on there, and I remember being willing to walk through the fear of what someone else would think about me. And that actually leads me into my next question, which is because I believe that in every step we get the opportunity, we are called to surrender something. In step 5, what did you find yourself being called to surrender, or did you surrender?
That's a really good question. I think there was still a lot of fear being shown, everything that was being displayed to me. Around the time of, I remember it was pretty soon after I did my fifth step, was when my grant sponsor told me, he goes, Zach, having an ego doesn't necessarily means that you're better than everyone. It may also mean that you think that you have caused more harm than anyone. And that hit me like a brick wall. I had never in my life ever thought about having an ego, and that implying that, I feel as though that I'm worse than everyone. And that just made so much sense to me, because it just made me like have my life flash before my eyes.
Right.
Everything that I had done, I always thought was worse. No one's as bad as me. No one's lived a life as terrible as mine.
Right.
So I think, in the fifth step, there were a lot of resentments that I had where I felt as though I definitely felt as though I was in the right, and I felt as though I was better than other people. But then there were a lot of people on my fifth step ideas and things in my fifth step where I thought that I was the worst kind of victim as well. And I did not realize that that was one thing. I thought those were two separate things. I thought, being in the right and then being a victim meant being on the side of righteousness, and then being on the side of victimhood. I didn't realize that righteousness and victimhood are literally live in the exact same plane of existence.
For sure.
So I think getting those two things to realize, and then also just my sex inventory as well, just the way that I was treating my girlfriends and just partners in general. I thought that was one of those things that I would never, for a while there, I was like, I don't know if I ever should get into a relationship again. Like, I'm just this terrible person. and then there came all that victimhood again,
Right.
And
I'm glad that you keep using the word victimhood, because I can tell you that I've heard a lot of fifth steps, and certainly I've done 3 official fifth steps with 3 different sponsors, and in almost all of them, there is what we uncover is this unbelievable amount of us believing that we're victims. Right. That life is happening to me, the world is out to get me, and
them.
Right. Us versus them, and how incredibly wrong was I? I mean,
Absolutely.
it just wasn't the truth, right? I love that that I have an understanding today that a relationship with a God of my understanding enforces spiritual principles in my life, right? And every time I read inventory, whether it be in a fifth step or whether it be in an ongoing 10 or 11, that the book, and in fact, in the fifth step, in the 12 and 12, it promises three things. It promises that we're going to receive an end to loneliness and a sense of belonging. Two, a feeling that we could be forgiven and that we are able to forgive others. And then three, a desire for true humility, which is a clear recognition of what and who I really am,
Sure.
followed
Yeah.
by a sincere attempt to become what I could be, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree.
You know, we hear a lot about the 9-step promises, and one of the things that I'm grateful for is in a group that I used to be involved in when I was living in New York City. It was called, well, it started off being called the PPAW group, the Promises, Prayers, Actions, and Warnings group. We went through the big book and we studied the big book, we ripped it apart, and we looked for all of the promises, all of the prayers, all of the actions, and all of the warnings in the first 164 pages. And one of the things that we uncovered through that process is there are a whole lot more promises than just the 9-step promises.
Right. Absolutely.
And the reason that I bring that up is because I think it's important that we highlight, while you don't hear them talked about a lot, there are 5th step promises. And it says on page 75 in our big book, it says this quote, "Once we have taken this step, withholding nothing, we are delighted." And it goes on to say that 7 things will occur. 1, we can look the world in the eye. 2, we can be alone at perfect peace and ease. 3, our fears fall from us. 4, we begin to feel the nearness of our Creator. 5, we may have had certain spiritual beliefs, but now we begin to have a spiritual experience. 6, the feeling that the drink problem has disappeared will often come strongly. And lastly, number 7, we feel that we are on the broad highway, walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. And it's interesting. I can't tell you the number of people that I have heard say that, well, after I did my 5th step, I didn't feel like I was walking hand in hand on the broad highway with the spirit of the universe. I didn't feel that. But at some point, if you unpack it and get down to its root, there was some feeling, whether it was huge or small, there was some feeling of relief.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that once, because I think I like the day that I remember like going to my sponsor's house and just sitting in that study with him. It was just all this bottled up fear of like, oh my God, what is he gonna think?
Right.
And then little by little, a lot of that, that hard outer shell of fear just kind of started to dissipate, just as like, oh my God, I'm telling him these things and he's not reacting the way that I think he's going to react. In fact, he's not reacting at all. He's just taking this very matter of fact. I think it was, little pieces throughout the hours that we were together. And then, I think I've shared this before, in meetings, but, at the end of my first 5th step, doing my 4th step, there was one thing that I withheld on my 4th step because this thing was going to be with me until the day that I died.
Right.
Even then, I wouldn't tell anyone. And it was at the end of the 5th step, and I'm packing my things and I'm ready to go. And my sponsor's like, all right, cool. And then he looked at me dead in the eye and he said, "Now, what have you lied to me about since you've been here?" And I don't know, like he pierced into my soul when he said that.
Right.
And it seemed as though that he was looking at this thing through my eyes and he knew exactly what I needed to say. And I just said, screw it. I told him, and he was like, all right, we'll just write that down. And again, I thought I was gonna get this big reaction out of him. But in hindsight, it was because of how unokay I was with the situation. It was because of all the shame, all the guilt, all the terrible feelings that I had, connotated towards this incident, that, it's just like I felt as though that every person in the world also felt exactly the same way about the situation.
Right.
But it was met with grace and love, and you know what? It's not that bad. In fact, it's
Right.
not bad at all. Like, it's okay. Like, I've done that before too, and it's just like, every time. So I think that was also a turning point in my understanding of like, when I think things need to be bottled up, because I feel that no one will ever understand. No
Right.
one will meet it with the grace that I need them to. I have been shown time and time and time again in sobriety that if I think something is one way, it may be that way. But if it's something where I think is, if it's an incident in my own life, or if it's a resentment or what have you, if I talk to someone else about it, I'm always shown something that I haven't seen before. Or, the ego will pop back in and say, this is way worse than anything anyone has ever done.
Right.
And it's always people in my life, and especially my sponsors, that tell me, you know what, it's really not that bad. Like, they bring me back to reality,
And one of
So
them, no, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that, like, having that understanding, made it, it made me want to go through 6 and 7 and be like, God, holy crap, my entire life I've thought that I was one way, but there are good things, but there are things that I don't want, and there's a lot of things that I look at in the world that are just twisted and delusional. I want to grow towards you so you can help me see the world the way that it really is, and see
Absolutely.
the world that the way you want me to see it. And I mean, I think we talked about this yesterday, like, or some other point. A lot of the times, most people in my life don't change at all, but for some reason, the way that I look at them and the way I interact with them has changed.
Right.
Like, what's the deal with that? Like, it was never a condition. It was like, the way that I am is never on the condition of the outside world. It's
Well,
always the condition of my inner world.
it speaks to the idea of what Bill tells us on 567, that the definition of a spiritual experience is a personality change.
Mhm.
I get to experience a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. I am called, when I walked in the door, even though I thought that it was really only going to be about just putting down the bottle,
Mhm.
I am called through the spiritual principles in our 12 steps to learn how to become a different man, right? It's nowhere in our literature anywhere, but I've heard it said many times that the same man will drink again,
Mhm.
right? If I am not willing to allow these spiritual principles to change me, I am going to continue living the life that I've always lived. And that's one of the things that I think that the 5th step does for us, is it begins to chip away at all of those things that for years and years and years have just ate at our soul.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
And kept me from being the man of dignity and the man of integrity that I know God put me on this earth to be.
Mhm.
Right. Jack, we're just about out of time, but before we head out, I want to offer you the opportunity to share if there's anything that you'd like to offer as a closing comment on step 5, anything that you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put the spiritual principle of it into practical application in their lives.
Sure. I think something that's very important is that, later in my sobriety, random memories and random thoughts would start to pop back in, and literally I would go, oh crud, like, I didn't put that on my 4-step, or I completely and honestly forgot to write this down. Don't feel guilty about it. I think a lot of people have done that. I think what's most important is that when something like that arises to the surface, and you feel as though it's something that needs to be spoken with somebody, well, one, your intuition is probably right. And it's all about the willingness to do something about it, as opposed to going back into old habits and being like, no, this one is not too bad, I'm going to put it in my back pocket and we're not going to talk about this one. That literally is just going to keep me 1 degree off the track. And if I keep going in that direction, that's literally, hypocritical of the way that I conducted myself in my initial 12 steps. If doing the 12 steps once, like, I'm not done after that. It's a continual fluid, existence where I'm consistently in this, area where I'm consistently trying to live in 1 through 12 on a regular basis throughout my life. And the moment I step outside of that, for me, in my truth, I believe that if I stray away from the 12 steps, if I stray away from seeking, what it is that a higher self looks like for me, if I'm not trying to seek counsel with my friends, if I start to go back into isolation, if I start keeping things to myself, I know exactly where I'm going to end up. And I know for me, if I drink again, for me, I'm going to end up dead. So.
And I'm really grateful that you shared that about the idea of something popping up after the fact and what to do with it. I've had many sponsees who have said, I'm afraid that it's not going to be, well, I've had them say it's not going to be perfect, a perfect 4-step, right? The reality is, and I tell them it is going to be as searching and fearless and thorough as it can be at that moment.
Right.
And that's all we're called. That's all we're called to do. And if something pops up later on down the line, great. Be aware of it. Share, talk about it, share it. Look at what the corrective measures are on it. Ask God to remove it. And then let him do it in 7, right? So Zach, thank you so much for your time and for your service. I'm confident that our listeners are going to be able to take away a lot with your sharing. So thanks for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all 3 of our legacies in AA through STEP, tradition, and concept studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this: we clearly see AA in 3 dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA couldn't function. God bless.